The following is from Maurice Nicoll. This is Book 3 of the Psychological Commentaries on Ouspensky and Gurdjieff. This talk was given September the 11th, 1948, and is called A Note on Violence. A man cannot do unless he overcomes violence. Violence always breeds violence. Doing by means of violence is not doing. All history, which is a history of crime, shows how violence cannot do in the work sense. War follows war. On one occasion, Ouspensky showed us clearly that from the esoteric point of view, everything had to be done through the realization of how to do things, and this enabled one not to act violently. He said this does not mean acting from the sentimental reason of not forcing people, but from the standpoint of understanding how useless it was. In this connection he said how the virtuous behaviour of people is mechanical or sentimental, because it is done merely for the sake of the behaviour itself, and not with the knowledge of why such behaviour might be necessary. On many occasions he spoke of mechanical behaviour as distinct from conscious behaviour. A man, say, is trained to behave in a certain way. In the case of mechanical behaviour, this man behaves therefore as he must do, as he cannot help doing. It is mechanical whether it is good or bad behaviour. He may imagine he could behave otherwise, but when the situation arises he behaves as he always does. Conscious behaviour is only possible when a person has observed and separated from mechanical behaviour, which lies in personality. A conscious man behaves from his understanding of what is necessary. Possessing will, he can will his behaviour. But a mechanical man is governed from outside, that is, by external circumstances, and so cannot will his behaviour in any particular situation from an independent source within. Now, as long as a man is governed from outside, he will not be able to overcome violence. Ouspensky said, "Violence is an emotional state in all people, doing things with violence, trying to impose upon others, coerce them, and so on." Now notice that Ouspensky said that violence is the emotional state of all people, and reflect on what that means. People do not think they rest ultimately on violence, yet regard what happens in life now and historically. Who is the man or the woman who can say that their basis does not rest on violence? You may have charming pictures of being charming. Well, I advise you to look more deeply. And here I would add this. How can we conceive a person not ultimately based on violence, a man, a woman, that nothing would make violent? And so for a moment let us reflect on an early conversation of Ouspensky's about what a conscious man might be as apart from a highly developed mechanical man in life. In thinking of a great man, a conscious man, we tend to think of a larger life man. He would be a larger man, simply a larger mechanical man, a giant, so to speak. But this is a quite wrong idea of what a conscious man would be, because a conscious man is a different man from a mechanical man. He is not larger, stronger, more wealthy, and so on. He is an utterly different kind of man. He is a man not based on violence. That is, he is a man of another kind who is not interested in or affected by what interests or affects a mechanical man. In fact, he may appear a very ordinary man, yet ruffle even his hair, and he does not mind, because he is passive to violence. Violence does not govern him, and so there is nothing in him to catch hold of, no jealousy, no envy, no hatred, and so on. Why? Because he is a different man from us, and his centre of gravity is not outside him. Is he then imperturbable? Why, if the house is falling down in an earthquake, he would probably run out of it first, yet he is not based on violence. We can therefore, at our small level of understanding the work, and what the difference is between a mechanical man and a conscious man, realize that a conscious man never acts from violence, and so, in this exercise of self-study, observe the part that violence plays in us, and from this deduce whether we are near the conscious circle of humanity or not. Now, as Ouspensky taught, violence from the esoteric standpoint is useless. What does the esoteric standpoint mean? It means that from the standpoint of the conscious circle of humanity, from which comes all esoteric or inner teaching, violence is the sign of a mechanical man, and a mechanical man, however many rituals and creeds he follows, is incapable of reaching a high level of being unless he has worked and again worked on his violence. Understand, there are no results through violence. Violence breeds violence with all its hatreds, revenges, jealousies, envies, and so on. Is this not a formidable factor to face in one's work on oneself? I would say so from my own experience with myself, and I hope you understand that we have experiences in life and experiences with ourselves, and they are different, and the work is mainly about one's experiences with oneself. I would say that we have to deal with this lunatic and tramp called oneself. Yes, an interesting study. I once said to myself, reviewing how I had behaved violently on a particular occasion, "It is obvious I am a tiny bit a mad person to behave as I have done." You will understand that through the power of the work I actually could see myself in the wrong, but I assure you that if you are only in the power of life you will never see that you are really wrong, and so will continue to act from open or latent violence. Further note on violence, September the 18th, 1948. A man cannot do unless he overcomes violence. Violence always breeds violence. Doing by means of violence is not doing. All history, which is a history of crime, shows how violence cannot do in the work sense. War follows war. We spoke last time of how conscious man acts without violence. Since the work teaches that we are based on violence, we must not imagine that just hearing from time to time that this is so is going to change anything in us. The study of violence in oneself is a lifelong study. Mechanical man is rooted in violence, and one meaning of rebirth is to be born beyond violence, to become conscious in thinking and feeling on a level beyond violence. On the level of violence, in the plane, so to speak, we have many enemies. That is, at our ordinary mechanical level, we have many dangerous violent eyes that are our enemies and seek to destroy our understanding. For nothing destroys understanding more than violence. But if we rise above this plane, if, so to speak, we ascend the mountain a little way, we are no longer subject to violent eyes. Our difficulty then is to keep our thought strong enough to remain at that level. So we fall down in our thinking very soon, at least for many years, partly because we have not yet understood the secret, namely, that to get to a different level we must give up certain habitual ways of thinking and feeling to begin with. We do not see that psychological movement is as real as physical movement, and that both demand effort. To ascend the mountain in oneself requires effort, and to maintain the position reached requires effort. We must realize from the ray of creation that there are different levels in ourselves. So one must not only remember oneself in many different ways, but intimately associate oneself with the ideas of the work, so that they enter the mind and effect small transformations of mechanical states at all times. This continual inner intercourse with the work, which especially demands the presence in oneself of a good work memory and the possession of a book of good photographs of oneself taken over many years by means of self-observation, gradually brings about, or rather makes possible, many changes, some quite unexpected. One begins to feel the existence of another will, apart from one's self-will, and with this inner perception one becomes aware of many meanings, hitherto hidden in some of the most familiar work sayings that one hitherto thought one understood well enough already. Let us all realize that understanding, the most powerful force we can create in ourselves, always lies in seeing more and more deeply what we thought we understood. that is, understanding, if this continual intercourse with the work is kept going, is the development of inner octaves. Where we saw previously only one thing, we now see 10, 100, 1,000 things. Do you see what is meant here? As Ouspensky said, and I will give what he said from what I remember, but not verbatim, he said, "The Gospels are a test for your development of understanding. You may imagine you know and understand them, but as you begin to change, as your level of understanding grows, you will see more and more things in what you thought you understood." And he added, "The Gospels are esoteric books. They will accompany you all through your work. Their meaning is such that they develop as you internally develop." Now from this let us pass to the difficult sentence in the Gospels about the kingdom of heaven, which is for me, to begin with, the conscious circle of humanity. In the work which comes from conscious man, we wake eventually, after years of dullness, quibbling and misunderstanding, to realize that another will must be born in us by beginning to obey what the work says, not by compulsion, but through the increasing light of the understanding of why the work exists, and what we mean and what it means to us. In looking round at a world of violence, we simply see violence breeding violence. War, which is based on violence, threatens man always, because man is based on violence. From this, possibly, we realize that our individual work is to observe violence in ourselves. Well, what does this strange phrase in the Gospels mean? Christ is speaking of John the Baptist, who had literal but not psychological understanding, and so was clad in animal skins. Christ says, "Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women there hath not arisen a greater than John the Baptist. Yet he that is but little in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and men of violence take it by force." Matthew chapter 11 verses 11 and 12. In speaking of this strange thing, I will recapitulate first of all what Ouspensky said about violence. He said, "Violence is an emotional state in all people, doing things with violence, trying to impose upon and coerce, to insist. From the esoteric point of view, this is useless. Nothing can be done in this way. A violent man cannot do. Even although a man has knowledge, if he has not overcome violence in himself, his work will go wrong." Then he added, "The meaning of the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and men of violence take it by force, is this. It means violence on oneself. Not to act with violence is violence on oneself. A man, in observing himself, and finally realizing where he is violent, in which centre, in what forms of behaviour, and so on, must do violence to himself to overcome his violence." Speaking as I am in terms of commentary on what the work teaches, I would say that violence on oneself, on one's violence, requires the highest possible insight into what one is. Because if one works consciously on oneself in regard to one's violence, one then can see that one can only get to a higher level, only go up this mountain that we spoke of, through force, and all force is gained only by working against a feature in oneself. So the higher level of oneself, represented relatively by a psychological state at a better level than one's mechanical state, is only gained by violence on certain eyes, certain habits of thought, feeling, attitudes, pictures, and so on. This gives force. Also, Ouspensky said once, "You will gain more force by working on your chief feature." To work on anything in oneself that is a habit and so mechanical gives some force. Notice that the kingdom of heaven is taken by force, and understand that force is made through not going with your mechanical self. If I do violence to Dr. Nicoll, I will get force. Where I put this force belongs to another conversation, but I will only say here, unless you have an aim to make force by working against some mechanical or habitual side of yourself is not enough. One must work on oneself, deny oneself, so that the force goes into one's aim.